I got a meal of Bahagi. I didn't actually know he was going to tell that story, but it mightn't be too bad if it happened actually in those initials. Sean said he came here in the 80s. I think I first toddled down the Silver Strand in Mallinbeg in the 50s, and I've been coming to Donegal on a pretty regular and irregular basis ever since. I suppose before I start this, I should say I remember the day very well in Castlebar, and the late C.J. Haughey was actually brought into the world by my grandaunt, who was a midwife. She also delivered the late Micheál O'Moran and the late Joe Lenihan, who described her subsequently as a freelance midwife. Said she had a bicycle, a brown leather bag, and a scissors. And in the words of Shakespeare and later C.J. Haughey, she too did the state some service. So, I think that Martin Murphy would make a great candidate for Donegal. You'd never know. Stranger things have happened. He might get a newfound interest in politics. And I'd like to say this, first of all, to have the honour of being invited back to the Mulholland discussions here in Glenties at the McGill School is indeed a privilege. I want to say that to you, Joe. This year, above any other year, the circumstances that we find ourselves in and the situation that our country is in actually makes this school quite particular and very important in what's been discussed here, what's been said here, and what will emanate from here. My contribution this evening is obviously from the perspective of politics, being the only politician on this platform this evening. But I want to say to Martin Murphy that what he said is very much in line with my own thinking and the thinking of my party for quite some time. We are in a time of enormous challenge for Ireland. This country faces not just an economic crisis, but in my view, a crisis of national self-confidence. For the past 13 years, we were the Celtic tiger. We were the small nation, which was an inspiration to all others. But that Celtic tiger is now dead. And it forces us to ask some very hard questions about ourselves as a nation. Who are we now? How do we now wish to define ourselves? The answer for me is simple and profound. Before we were a tiger, we were a republic. Now, 60 years ago, John A. Costello announced the Declaration of Ireland being a republic, which was one of the great signal moments in this party's particular political history. 60 years on, we need to reinvent and reinvigorate that republic. We need once again to put, as they say, res publica, things of the people, at the heart of government. No one can deny the achievements of the Celtic tiger. People in Ireland became a richer, more self-confident, more diverse nation. But in building that Celtic tiger, we neglected the republic. And in the process, we sidelined many of our fundamental values. We stopped viewing ourselves as citizens. We all became consumers. The institutions that people in this country relied upon, the church, the legal system, the banking system, in many cases betrayed us and betrayed themselves. And politics failed to fill that void. It failed to fill that void. Instead, we created a huge gap between the government and the governed, between those on the inside and those on the outside. Much has been written about the cosy cartels, about the crony government, about the golden circles, about the cosy capitalism. All of these descriptions are merely different ways of explaining the same thing. And the same thing was the abduction of this republic by vested interests. A recent newspaper article put this very well. It said, in Ireland, we have an elite governing for a clique. If the man and woman in the street, in Glenties or anywhere else, are cynical about politicians and about politics, they have every right to be. Because for the last decade, this country was run for the benefit of the few rather than for the benefit of the many. This cannot be allowed to continue, and this will not be allowed to continue. In my view, the Fianna Fáil party of today has lost its sense of direction, and the political system of today has lost its sense of legitimacy. Our system has failed completely to live up to the vision of its founders. From the moment of its birth, 90 years ago, the first Dáil Éireann was forced to work without resources or power, was the focus of constant harassment and raids, but its very existence sent out a clear message to all. In the new Irish state, the Parliament, the Oireachtas, would be supreme. But in Ireland today, power has been sucked away from the Oireachtas to government. Over the past 2 weeks, there are two clear examples of this in the way it's operated in the People's Forum in Dáil Éireann. First, the government curtailed scrutiny of important legislation by guillotining 8 separate bills. That means without adequate and comprehensive and thorough discussion by the representatives of the people of all parties and none, government said, time up, we're not having any more discussion on this, ram it through. Then it completely bypassed the Oireachtas by publishing the McCarthy report and the report on the Lees Cross nursing home when the Dáil had gone into recess. And if it wasn't all so serious, it would indeed be quite farcical. Well, this was in the face of government deputies all over the country saying on local radio stations that Dáil should sit for the month of July and then vote to close the place down before you got into July proper in the first place. Unfortunately, in this country, there seems to be a view that political reform has nothing to do with the real economy. That view is completely false. It was our political system, ladies and gentlemen, and its weaknesses that fatally undermined our economy. You see, the IMF tells us that our recession is the worst of all the advanced economies, that we face a lost decade of low growth, high unemployment, and social misery. Why did this happen? How have we gone from a 9 billion surplus to a 25 billion deficit in a space of 2 years? How has that been allowed to happen by the political system that we have in this country and by which people are elected to government and to govern? Why were the bankers and the developers not dealt with before it was too late? Why did that happen? Was it not the result of a political culture that liked to cozy up to the rich and powerful, as was exemplified for years in the so-called Galway tent? Why have we tolerated weak competition and high costs in key sectors of our economy? During her speech at the McGill School this week, your own Taoiseach from Donegal spoke about reducing professional fees. I agree. We've been talking about this for years. But why has there been no action through the floor of the Forum of the People in Dáil Éireann? Could it be that some vested interests seem to have a veto in social partnership? Why do we have a budgetary system in place that you couldn't operate a corner shop with, never mind an economy for 4 million people? Why is that? Has it anything to do with the replacement of accountability in the public service by a new cosy relationship between ministers, senior civil servants, trade unions, government agencies and regulators? My answers to those questions are yes, yes and yes. And that's why your money was wasted on useless voting machines or on P-PAR systems that are unworkable and so many other debacles. That's why they happened. And then we have the horrors of the Ryan report. Horrors that our political system either ignored or, to our eternal shame, facilitated. How I ask you, can any self-respecting political system allow systematic abuse of our children for decades? I said in the Dáil, and speaking on this, Ireland cries with the abused. I admire their courage in coming out to tell their story. And the fundamental truth of all of this is that our political system is broken, our political culture is discredited, and we cannot fix either our economy or have a just society unless and until we also fix our politics. And that politics has to see that irrespective of position or circumstance, that those who are guilty of criminal activities face the rigors of the law and be seen to pay the price. Now, for the public, you know, political reform tends to mean reducing the number of TDs. Some say we'd be well off with 5 TDs or 50 TDs or whatever else. I support the concept of reducing the scale of the Oireachtas. You have to resource your public representatives to serve the people who elect them. People are rightly outraged at politicians asking for sacrifices while exempting themselves from major cuts. That's why I favour a reduction in the number of TDs. And if in the census of 2011 you applied the existing structures within the Constitution, you could actually reduce the numbers of TDs somewhere between 10 and 20, even down as far as 142. That's without having a constitutional amendment. But that of itself won't do anything for political reform. It might make the current system less expensive, but it won't make it any more effective. And to do that, we need to go a lot further down the road of change. In 2000, this party published a really radical document called the Democratic Revolution. It was a clarion call for change within the political system. It was completely ignored. Under my own leadership now, Fine Gael is developing an even more comprehensive reform package and an agenda for a new politics in Ireland. In due course, we will present our own budgetary proposals to deal with the current financial crisis and the future. In due course, I intend to appoint a transition team to oversee and plan the effective commencement of programmes for government that are achievable and that are going to work. And as Taoiseach, please God, I intend to be the enforcer of government policy to see that it happens in the interest of the people. And ministers who don't measure up will be moved on, and any minister who might abuse their position will be dismissed. Our starting point is simple. The huge centralisation of power in this country is totally incompatible with a healthy republic, and it actively encourages inefficiency. Under the new politics, we will redistribute power from the executive to the Oireachtas, from central to local government, and from the bureaucracy to the citizens of our republic. I believe that the state has a vital role to play in Ireland's recovery, and I do not agree with those who seek to demonise or scapegoat the public service. I'll tell you why. This government has sidelined and ignored the potential and the contribution of public servants for many years. Every time there was a problem, they ran off to the next consultant to do another report, which was lengthy and expensive and lay on department shelves gathering dust and was not implemented, and nobody accepted responsibility. In my view, the public service will always respond to decisive leadership where clear objectives are held and where motivation and cause is evident. But if we're to do more with less, as Peter McClune acknowledged here in McGill on Tuesday, we have to create that smart state that spends money wisely and prioritises delivery over bureaucracy. Under the new politics, Fine Gael will dismantle the command and control module in every public sector and give responsibility to those who know best, that is the people on the front line. Our recent fair care proposals are already based on this approach, which we will roll out across the public sector. Now, I want to say this. We're not talking here about tinkering with the health system. We are talking about turning it on its head, about revolutionizing the way we spend money, about revolutionizing the impact of that money, where the patient is central, where efficiencies are built into the system, where delivery is managed, and where those efficiencies are then spent on recruiting further frontline staff like doctors, nurses, physios, and so on. It's not mythical, it's not fantasy, it's not theoretical. It works for 16 million in the Netherlands, and it can work here in Ireland for our 4.2 million. We're spending 16,000 million of your money for a health system that is supposed to be world class, but that does not live up to that standard. There are brilliant people in areas of the HSE, but it just doesn't measure up in terms of the reform. I've made the point that in the area of the acute care system, there are actually 83 different bodies and agencies dealing with it. 83. Many of them duplicate and triplicate the work of each other. This just cannot go on, and it's for that reason that I talk about the big revolution that we need to make in reform, where you don't just tinker with the edges, you actually completely change the way we've done things and the way that it can operate as best practice in other countries. The need for fundamental reform has been amply demonstrated by McCarthy this week. This is a damning indictment of the way the government have run the country for the last decade. Because in one swoop, McCarthy's report has sidelined hundreds of consultants' reports that lie on department shelves, unimplemented, and for which you paid. And the sheer volume of recommendations in there, many of which came from public servants themselves, points to a complete failure of management and direction by the government. I accept that some very hard decisions have to be made. And I'm oftentimes accused of always giving out to Brian Cowan and always giving out about the government. But you know, it's 7 years since down in Killarney, I said, if you're going to pay benchmarking, make sure that you get efficiencies in return. That didn't happen. It's now costing $2 billion a year. Last year I said, you know, you're not going to be able to pay the national wage agreement in the situation that we find ourselves. In November I said you need a recapitalisation programme for the banks because small businesses are losing jobs by the week. Then said you're going to have to wind up and take over Anglo-Irish and wind it down. And now then you're going to have a new budget. All of these things were rejected, but they happened. So we talk about hard choices and about support for the country. It's been there in leaps and bounds from this party in terms of job creation, job protection, and schemes that the government can take in the morning, or at least give us a considered response to proposals. I accept that numbers in the public service will have to decline. I'm concerned, I have to say, about the whole emphasis on proposals to cut social welfare. My belief is that the social welfare register, the live register, the best way of dealing with that is to create jobs, create incentives to protect jobs, invest in job creation, put the people back to work. You heard Martin Murphy here this evening, the chief executive of a major international corporation in this country, speaking about potential. We have hundreds of entrepreneurs out there who are quite willing to move into that space, but politics and government and governance has to give that wallpaper, that environment, that atmosphere where that kind of flair and creativity can flourish. That's the way you deal with your social welfare problem. Put the people back to work. And while Colin McCarthy is a valuable contribution, it is a valuable contribution, I think we have to be very careful here about saying that this is not the only agenda in town. I've asked all my own frontbenchers to come up with their proposals, and there are others. There are areas that McCarthy hasn't touched on. It is a comprehensive list, but it is not the only agenda, as I say. The McCarthy report, or elements of it, will prove useless if it's not accompanied by the job stimulus package that I'm talking about. We produced, for instance, a proposal for an economic recovery action plan, 11 billion of an investment from the from Europe and from the National Pension Reserve Fund. which would create, for starters, 100,000 jobs in clean water, broadband, technology, renewable energy, all of these areas. And a further programme for the protection of 80,000 jobs. That's there for the government in the morning if they want to take it. I don't underestimate the scale of the challenges that we face here. I don't. Because I meet people every day. And politics is about people. And I know their stories. And I know the concern and the anxiety and the deep-rooted anger that's out there at the way this country was allowed to drift and the way that the political system allowed that to drift. I know that Irish people are always and have always been able to measure up to whatever the scale of the challenge is, provided they know the full scale of that. And you haven't been told the full truth. And I'd like to see all of the evidence given by every State Department to McCarthy. I'd like to see all of that so that we can see on that basis and on what comes from the Commission of Taxation and from our own estimate as to how best we can move forward. I believe that it is critical that when we look at what's happening in the international scene, that we continue to be central, to play the central part we've always played in the building of the European Union process. And I hope that when we ask the people in October to support Lisbon, that they will do that in that referendum. Because you can see the implications and the opportunities that are there for Ireland as part of a 500 million unit. When you look 15 years down the road at economic development, China, India, Japan, Russia, South Africa, Brazil, the United States. Is Europe in there? Not at the moment. We've got to look at the capacity and the potential that exists for our little country as part of a 500 million grouping. Latest reports would indicate that Vietnam will be the 10th strongest economy by 2020. When President Kennedy announced 40 years ago, I was out in Inisheer actually, that when they landed on the moon, when he announced in the 60s that America would put a man on the moon, people said this is crazy. No more than Martin Murphy 40 years on saying my daughter's watching television programs on her PC or BlackBerry or whatever it might be. People laughed at that notion. So my vision for this country, and this has got to be built through a combination of all of these factors, but central to it is the political pillar and the environment that politics can create and the trust that it's got to build with the people of the country about where we want to be in 3 years, 5 years, 20 years. This is the point I made earlier today. The children starting primary school in September will be carrying this country in 25 years' time. We've got to get that right. I agree fully with you, Martin. The Department of Education is absolutely fundamental to the future of every person in this country. So what's my vision for my country? I want to see full employment. I want to see stable public finances. We had this before. I had it before. We can do it again. I want an Ireland where we can export energy, including electricity, and I know that Pádraig McManus is here, and create tens of thousands of jobs in low-carbon, high-tech economy. Our own economic recovery action plan points the way towards that. I want a health system where the two-tier system is abolished, where the patient is central, where money follows the patient, where hospital wards and operating theatres are seen as a resource, and patients are seen as a resource, and not an obstacle to closing the place down. I want an education system that meets the requirements of the future, where our young people can be equipped and develop and win the challenges of the new industries of the 21st century. We do not know now what developments are going to come from genetics, or robotics, or the internet, or nanotechnology in the next 10, 15 years, but we must be ready. I want a new politics that will work for all the people, that will create that transformation of a vigorous public sector, where the people in the front line are in charge, where they are accountable in their responsibilities and not dictated to by some central department. I want ministers in the next government to answer questions on the floor of the Dáil on behalf of the people and not hive them off to some agency where nobody seems to care because nobody has a sense of responsibility or accountability to the people. That's the republic that I stand for. I want our country to continue to be an information society as we always were for the last 2,000 years. We send out teachers and missionaries to inform other peoples in other countries. I want to see our young people able to ride the waves of change that are beginning out there now on that global ocean, to master those changes and to direct them towards Ireland's way and for our people's benefit. I want this country to be up there with the very best, nimble, smart, flexible, able to adapt and change according to the circumstances. That potential is all there, but it has to be given the opportunity to flourish. And in my view, it cannot happen under a government removed from reality and exhausted by its own inability to cope with the consequences of its own mismanagement. But most of all, I want to live in a country which is a republic in reality and not just in name, where the young and the vulnerable are protected, where the aged and the venerable are respected, and where able bodies and agile minds can continue to develop this nation's potential. These goals, ladies and gentlemen, are all achievable, but they require the kind of sustained effort and imagination that allowed the United States to put a man on the moon. They require all our maximum efforts to achieve our clear objectives. I firmly believe, genuinely believe this, that if we have the courage and the vision to chart a new and bold course for our republic, this country will again rise to the top, will become a nation of prosperity and a nation of fairness, a republic of which we can all be proud. I can't predict the future. I can't predict the future. But I believe deep down inside myself that we will win the next election. And if I am given the opportunity, it will be my honor and my privilege to meet that challenge with an energetic team of competent people that can chart that new direction for this country into the future. Build a country of which we can all truly be proud. Go raibh míle maith agaibh.